The 4% rule is the most common rule referenced for retirement spending. But the 4% rule was designed to make sure you survive your retirement years. It was not intended to allow you to thrive. In fact, your most likely outcome if you follow the 4% rule is dying with hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of unspent money. Now, if your goal is to pass on a lot of money to your beneficiaries, great. But if you'd like to spend your money in retirement, especially in the early years, you just need a different approach. So in this video, I'm going to share with you 3 retirement spending approaches that allow you to safely spend more. If you're new here, hi, I'm Rachel Camp. I am a CFP professional and the founder of Camp Wealth, and I'm here to help you retire before age 65. Look, I know many people in the financial community are die-hard fans of the 4% rule, but here's the reality. Based on historic numbers, if you follow the 4% rule, over 2/3 of the time you will die with double your initial balance, and only 10% of scenarios you end with less than 100% of what you started retirement with. The worst case scenario historically was one scenario retiring in 1966, where the retiree had to follow the 4% rule to never run out of money. Now, this survival rate of 4%, it's based on a 30-year time horizon. But if you want to retire earlier, what does that look like? Well, for one, the 4% rule now becomes the 3.5% rule, which makes sense. If you retire, say, at age 50 instead of 65, we have to be a little bit more conservative with our numbers. But the same problem we had with the 4% rule actually becomes worse when you have that longer time horizon with retiring early. If we assume you have a $1 million portfolio and you're following the 3.5% rule because you're retiring early, these are the numbers. You have a 90% chance of finishing with over $3 million and only 10% chance wealth is anywhere below $3 million and a 50% chance of finishing with more than $9.3 million. There is one failing scenario that necessitates the 3.5% withdrawal rate. Now, before we get into these alternative spending approaches, we do need to understand that one scenario where the 4% or 3.5% rule does save you from running out of money. So Bill Bengen is the founder of the 4% rule. He published the study on safe withdrawal rates in 1994 and found something really interesting. A safe withdrawal rate has almost nothing to do with your average returns. Many people ask me, hey Rachel, my portfolio returned 10% this year. Why can't I take out that 10%? Or hey, I'm expecting 6% average returns based on historical numbers, so why can't I take out 6% or even 5%? This is why. Your safe withdrawal rate has almost nothing to do with your average return. The safe withdrawal rate depends almost entirely on the sequence of returns. So specifically the returns you experience right after you retire. So hypothetically, we could have 2 retirees, one who retires at a terrible time, maybe right before the crash of 2008, so they experience a terrible sequence of returns right away. The second retiree maybe retires at a good time, but their second half of retirement has bad returns. So let's assume they actually average out about the same to about 6% over their retirement. Those 2 retirees are actually going to have very different safe withdrawal rates because it's based on the sequence of returns. The first retiree who retired into a down market may have to follow the 4% rule for their entire retirement. Well, the second retiree who started with a good market in retirement will actually have a higher safe withdrawal rate throughout retirement. It's all about the returns you experience when you first retire. Now, in Bill Bengen's study of 400 retirees since 1926, only one retiree who retired in 1968 had to stick to that 4% rule to avoid running out of money. So if we add some numbers to what this looks like with following the 4% rule, let's say you have a $1 million portfolio. That first year, you can spend $40,000, that's 4%, and then we make adjustments every year for inflation. So if inflation is 3% that first year, your year 2 spending is $41,200. If next year's inflation is 2%, your year 3 spending is $42,024, and on and goes. So if you are that retiree who retired in 1968 and had a 30-year retirement, that's what you would do for the entirety of your retirement, the 4% rule. But what if you were one of the other 399 other retirees in Bill Bangan's study? We have options for you. Options that allow you to safely spend more. In fact, the third option I'm going to share with you today in this video is my favorite because it allows you to spend the most in your early retirement years. But I find a lot of retirees prefer this first strategy I'm going to share because it's a little bit more conservative and it works really well with human psychology. So the first strategy is called the ratcheting strategy, and it was created by Michael Kitchis, again, to solve this problem of, hey, if I experience a great market, can I be allowed to spend a little bit more? The way it works is by increasing your income if you experience a favorable sequence of returns. So you retire, you experience a great or even an average market, you get to give yourself some raises. Now, this works really well with human psychology because the strategy only goes in one direction. It's like a ratchet, it only goes up. So spending can increase, but it will never decrease. Thanks to Commoner, Evil Genius 007, our couple we are going to be using today is Fred and Wilma Flintstone. Now, Fred and Wilma start by telling me they never want to have to cut their spending, but they would like the option of increasing their spending. So Fred and Wilma, they have $1 million saved, and they want to understand, how does this ratcheting strategy work? So with this rule, we start with a floor. Fred and Wilma are retiring at 62, so we're going to assume the standard 4% rule, and that's our floor, 4%. Again, the floor will never be cut. So they start retirement with spending $40,000. You get the regular inflation increases every year as well, so it works exactly like the 4% rule initially. But how do we know when we can increase our spending? Well, we actually have a trigger based on portfolio performance. The trigger is when the portfolio grows by 50%. So in this example, it would mean going from a $1 million portfolio to a $1.5 million portfolio. Fred and Wilma, they get to give themselves a 10% spending increase. And then we recheck this about every 3 years. Now, if we look at how this has played out historically, you'll see on the graph there are 3 different outcomes. Best case scenario, you retire in a year like 1982, that's the blue line, and you get consistent spending increases every 3 years. If you retire in a year like 1973, that's the yellow-orange line, you start conservatively with the market crash in 1973, but eventually, second half of retirement, market picks up, you start to receive those spending increases. Worst case scenario, you retire in the year 1966, and you can see with the red line, it is just flatlined. Market never recovers enough to give you that spending increase. That's when you follow the 4% rule. Now, this is a great strategy if you don't have much flexibility in your budget, you never want to cut spending. But if you have a little bit more flexibility and you are willing to cut back in those down years, this next strategy will give you the ability to spend more right off the bat. So our second strategy is called the guardrails approach. It is created by Jonathan Guyton and William Klinger, and it keeps your spending within a set range. So let's bring back our couple, Fred and Wilma, and they now tell me, you know what, we've thought about it, we've gone back through our spending. We actually do have a little bit more flexibility in our spending. We've run the numbers, we can make cuts to our spending if we need to, but we'd really like to start off spending more in retirement. So I say, okay, let's discuss the guardrail strategy. So instead of starting you at the 4% withdrawal rate, we are going to jump that up to 5%, but we have guardrails now at 4% and 6%. So on their $1 million portfolio, we start with a $50,000 withdrawal. That's 5%. But we have an upper guardrail where if the portfolio hits 1.25 million, this would trigger a pay raise because your portfolio has hit the 4% guardrail, right? Because 4% of 1.25 million is 50K. Portfolio's done well, it's grown. So now we get that pay raise of 10%. This brings your new spending from $50,000 to $55,000. On the other hand, we also have a lower guardrail. The lower guardrail is at $833,000. So if the portfolio of 1 million falls to this number, now you've triggered the guardrail of 6%, right? 6% of 833,000 is 50K. We now have to go through a 10% spending cut. Income goes from 50K to 45K a year. I share these numbers with Fred and Wilma, and they think that's interesting. We could easily do a 10% cut because 45K is actually even more than what we need. They have other income sources, maybe rental income, maybe pensions. And this is where the light bulb goes off for me because I'm thinking they might be a great candidate for the next strategy, my personal favorite. This is the one I would follow if I were retiring. This is the flexible spending strategy created by Nick Majuli. And with this strategy, you are going to split up your spending into two categories: base spending and bonus spending. Now, your base spending is going to be all of the things you are not willing to cut back on or compromise on. And it doesn't just have to be, food, clothes, shelter. It can go beyond the necessities. Many retirees are going to include travel, for example, in their base spending because they are retiring so they can travel. So, no, that's not something that they are going to cut back on. That is in their base spending. Figure out what you want to spend every year or every month, no matter what. Then we are going to think about the spending that would be nice, but isn't a necessary requirement in retirement. This might be something like maybe taking the international trip versus domestic, maybe flying business class versus economy, fine dining versus regular dining, whatever that looks like for you. And now we are going to categorize this additional spending as bonus spending. And in the years things are going really well, you get to live it up with the bonus spending. So let's bring back Fred and Wilma. Like I mentioned before, Fred and Wilma tell me they can get by with less than $45K a year from the portfolio. In fact, they tell me about 40% of their spending they would categorize as bonus spending. So if we look at this heat map from Nick Majuli, a 40% bonus spending, or as Nick calls it, discretionary spending, actually allows you to start off with a 5.25% withdrawal rate and a 100% chance of success. So on our $1 million portfolio, our initial spending is now $52,500. 40% of this is $21,000, and that is our bonus spending, while $31,500 is our base spending. But we're not done there. We have our initial withdrawal rate, but now you need to understand the rules that go along with this. So on December 31st of every year, we are going to sit down with Fred and Wilma and reevaluate their portfolio, and we are going to adjust that bonus spending according to what the market has done. Now, there are three possible outcomes that are going to affect that bonus spending. Outcome number one is a normal market. So if the S&P 500, or whatever benchmark we end up using, is less than 10% away from its highs, you actually get to spend all of your bonus spending. So in the case of Fred and Wilma, we're good to spend that full $21,000. Now, outcome number two is a correction market. So if the S&P 500 is off more than 10% from all-time highs, but less than 20%, you spend half of the discretionary spending or the bonus spending in the next year. So for Fred and Wilma, if we experience this scenario, we would cut that down to $10,500 for the bonus spending. Outcome number three, bear market. Worst case scenario, S&P 500 is off more than 20% from all-time highs. In this scenario, we spend none of that discretionary spending. So Fred and Wilma just have to live off $31,500 from the portfolio, which is their base spending. Now, one important tweak here that you should understand, that base spending, so for Fred and Wilma, $31,500, it does get an inflation adjustment every year, but the discretionary or the bonus spending, it never adjusts for inflation. So for Fred and Wilma, it's always going to be at $21,000. Fred and Wilma now have several options they can use for retirement spending. The key is that they understand their own spending habits and they know when they can cut back. But most importantly, they've been enlightened by the fact that the 4% rule will save them in the worst case scenario, but it will not give them the green light to spend more when they can safely do so, which is why they just need a better approach. Now, if you'd like to take a better approach to retirement spending, I discuss how a couple with $2 million can safely retire, spending $120,000 a year in this video. I'll see you in the next one.